Chapter 1 Door of Space 5. Thanks to the cooperation of the Mad Horus, the task of taking control of the Free City was going smoothly. Some of the outlaws had noticed that the Free City was now in the hands of the House of Mammon and had rebelled. However, that fell short of a typhoon in a teacup. Out of the three factions, the outlaws were the most sensitive to strength and weakness. Most outlaws instinctively realized that they needed to conform to the new order. There were only a few who wanted to oppose the new order. Moreover, those who were reckless or insane enough to cause violence among that small minority disappeared without a sound, even before they knew the full truth. All of this was Ophelia's handiwork. Ophelia and Oros made the most intelligent and cooperative of Dargon's men, the orc mage Yukon, the new leader of the outlaw faction. Once again, the backlash was weak. This was because there was no one other than Yukon who was a potential candidate. This was the result of the screening operation. All of those that had the ability and charisma to lead a group of lawless men were either killed in the battle against Agares, suddenly disappeared one day, or left the Free City on their own feet. The Mad Horus was a wise man. Unlike his epithet, he knew a storm was coming from the west. If he hadn't gotten on board, then it would have caused trouble for the large ship. That was the House of Mammon. They were preparing to withstand that very storm. Oros' very cooperative nature had saved Ophelia more time and energy beyond what she had initially thought, and the result led to an earlier than scheduled visit to the House of Mammon. Ophelia, the daughter of Endeleon, greets the master of the House of Mammon. Ophelia, who showed her usual grace, greeted Eligor and the other spirits one after another. Catalina smiled, Skull chuckled, and Eligor showed a complex expression of both happiness and terror. Now that the dungeon had restructured, it took quite some time to walk from the dungeon's entrance room to the throne room. Since Yong-ho was a practical person, he had a conversation with Ophelia while they were on the move. Almost all of it was regarding the situation in the Free City. Ophelia, an information trader, knew exactly how to handle information. She knew how to wrap or distort, and knew how to concisely deliver only the most essential news. So as they arrived at the throne room, they were already done talking about the Free City. There was nothing more to share. However, Ophelia wasn't here just to talk about the Free City. We're going to need a new dungeon. Ophelia spread a map of the southern region across a large table in the newly constructed conference room beside the throne room. Colored pieces of wood that had been prepared in advance were placed on the map as indicators of power. It looked quite different from before. It felt like the vicinity surrounding the Free City had been emptied. The three dungeons of Foras, Ale, and Yubing had all disappeared, while the dungeons of Abigail and Jungerus had virtually less than half the power of before. And moreover, the Free City was now entirely under the House of Mammon's control. Ophelia pointed to the west of the southern region. The fight in the west is now escalating. Fortunately, it's not going to be settled in a single battle, but, as I first expected, it's going to last for another 2 to 3 months at the most. The Wolf Demon King, Embryo, was doing well against the Western Owners Alliance, which included almost all of the Western dungeon owners. Despite dozens of days of fighting, he wasn't being pushed back. The need for a new dungeon is to prepare for the end of the fight in the west. Ophelia stopped speaking and took a breath. She opened up a new map of the western and southern border area. The southern region is full of empty land, but there is still roads in place across the border. They lead to a vital strategic point. Several lines had been drawn on the map. All the lines looked like they were drawn at random. However, they all had one thing in common. They all passed a single point on the map. Whether the Western Owners Alliance or Embryo wins, it's likely that the winner will want to consume the South. So we need a fortress to stop them. It was difficult to capture a fortress built on a vital strategic point. Some would just ignore the fortress, pass by it and attack somewhere else. But that was a very dangerous idea. Of course, it wasn't impossible. It could be a very effective strategy if certain conditions were established. In most situations, however, this was not the case. Ignoring the heavily armed fortress and passing it by was the equivalent of turning your back against a sword-wielding opponent. The dungeon would act as both a powerful fortress and a deterrent. Building a defensive dungeon at this point will effectively negate any Western threats. The House of Mammon was no longer a declining family in the southern region. It was a powerful family of the south. Young-ho looked at Ophelia's map carefully. There was already a dungeon in place at that strategic point. We're going to have to target the dungeon of the House of Randalt. Yes, you must force the owner of Randalt's dungeon to surrender, or personally take it over by launching an attack. If he surrenders to one of the Western powers or makes way for them, then both the Free City and the House of Mammon will be in danger. Yong-ho touched his chin for a moment and organized his thoughts. He asked, Ophelia, will the master of the House of Randalt consider a surrender? The possibilities are 50-50. He is a man who does not behave rashly, as evidenced by his past actions. He's also extremely cautious. The master of the Randalt family simply stayed in his dungeon in the midst of a number of short-lived events. When the House of Forest was exploited by Jungerus, he remained silent, and he didn't even make a move when the Free City was exposed to the threat of Agares. If we have to attack, it's going to take a long time to fortify the dungeon again. Yes, you saw it right away. We don't know how the Randalt family will behave, but if you get your hands on the House of Randalt's dungeon, then you'll need to look at it from a slightly different perspective than Mammon's dungeon. It's not a castle that serves as a living space. You need to look at it as a battle-ready fortress. The renovations of the dungeon will also have to proceed in that direction. And, Ophelia took a breath. She suppressed her excitement and spoke in a calm voice. It won't be easy acquiring Randalt's dungeon. While it's important to have a necessary amount of time for fortification, it's even more important to carefully attack with causing any significant damage. You'll need to be fully prepared. It was a valid point. Although Yong-ho had attacked the dungeons of Al and Yubing in a row, both dungeons were almost completely devoid of any spirits guarding those dungeons. The fight against the House of Randalt would be the first official dungeon attack that Yong-ho had attempted. I understand. You're incredibly competent. At Yong-ho's straightforward praise, rather than being humble, Ophelia showed a graceful smile. Ophelia was like an alluring temptress disguised as a pure maiden. Okay. I'll leave the preparations of Randalt's attack to you, Ophelia. Organize what you need and report back to me. Yes, master. I'll follow your will. Ophelia, once again, gracefully showed respect. Yong-ho looked at Rickham, who was sitting in the corner of the conference room. Rickham, help Ophelia. The orcs are going to be involved in this attack, so I would like you to especially focus on training. Yes, Master. Rickham also showed Yong-ho his respect. There were two reasons for the mobilization of the orcs. The first was to minimize the damage of the attack. The more overwhelming their power was, the less potential damage would be caused by needless fighting. The second was for the orcs' growth. The best way to build one's evolution rate was to risk one's life. The fiercer the fight, the greater the increase of the evolution rate. He didn't intend to force the orcs into danger just for growth, but he couldn't just leave them in a safe place. The meeting was concluded. As Rickham left the conference room, Yong-ho began to talk about something else. I forgot to give you these earlier. It's a gift for you, Eligor. Inside the box, which Catalina had fetched from Yong-ho's was a pair of manacles. It was the item that he'd obtained after he cleared the 4th floor of the arena. Eligor had a look of emotion as he received the manacles. They weren't simply an ordinary pair of manacles, as Yong-ho had personally chosen them, with the power of greed from the arena. Despite their lightness, they seemed very firm, and there was no inconvenience regarding mobility of one's fingers or wrists. Thank you, master. No further words of thanks were required. Eligor's eyes had already begun to fill with tears. Come to think of it, it was the first time he had given something to Eligor, other than the bracelet. I need to care of him more often. It was a similar feeling for Yong-ho as when he gave his mother a present on Mother's Day. Ophelia's eyes glistened as she watched Eligor receive the pair of manacles. She smiled and looked at Yong-ho as if she was asking, "Is there anything for me?" Yong-ho now felt like he had switched roles. Instead, he now felt like a parent with multiple children. He smiled and held out an anklet made of bragada. He gave a short and concise explanation on the anklet's properties to Ophelia, whose eyes were glistening with happiness. Certainly, it won't be easy. Ophelia, who had dealt with the power of greed in the past, spoke while a slight trickle of sweat. Ophelia, who was quite confident in her mana control, knew that it was a power that couldn't be easily handled. However, it was also true that she was motivated to succeed. If she could handle it properly, then she would be able to achieve growth in an innovative way. The longer you spend training with it, the more efficient you'll become. So please continue to work hard, despite its difficulties. It was something he had heard from Chwiryong. Brigada not only amplified the power of the 7 deadly sins, but also stored them. Therefore, if Brigada was used for a long time, then it was possible for a subordinate to access the power of the 7 deadly sins, even without the support of the master. Of course, it would be less powerful than if Yongho himself applied it. After asking Ophelia to train Eligor and Skull, Yongho, alongside Catalina, headed towards the arena. The reason why Yongho had Catalina accompany him every time he went to the arena was simple. It was to prepare for Yongho's own potential defeat. Chwiryong always went to and fro from the arena alone, and then one day, she went missing. There was no one powerful enough to save Chwiryong in the Mammon family at the time, but it was clear that the fate of Chwiryong and the House of Mammon would have been a little different if they had known exactly where and how Chwiryong went missing. At least the chances of Endelion leaving the House of Mammon would have been greatly reduced. Yongho, along with Catalina, practiced how to use Brigada as they traveled to the arena. Yongho regained his breath as he gathered up the power of greed. Just like habit, he opened the door to the arena. However, as Yongho was on the verge of entering the arena, Catalina suddenly spoke up more loudly than normal. Master He. Yongho turned around. Astonished by her own voice, Catalina quickly swallowed her dry saliva. She took a large breath as she faced Yongho and then spoke with slightly drooping ears. I have a favor to ask of you, Yongho. Completely turned towards Catalina. It was no exaggeration to say that Catalina has stuck by his side ever since he had come to the demon world. It wasn't a short amount of time either, and during that time, Catalina had never revealed her needs. But now Catalina was asking him for a favor. Yongho had no choice but to take her seriously. Catalina swallowed her saliva again. Her ears straightened as she faced Yongho. For the first time, she revealed her desires. I want to challenge the first floor of the arena. Please let me. Her demand was a concern. Yongho spoke to rebuke her. The penalty is different from mine. Moreover, it can be incredibly dangerous. Chwiryong traveled alone to prevent the spirits of the Mammon family from challenging the arena. As Guxian had warned, the arena's penalties were harsher for ordinary spirits. Catalina knew that. But she couldn't give up. It wasn't something she asked with complacency. But Master, I'm your guard. She wanted to be strong. As the heir to the King of Greed, she wanted to stand by her master's side as he was advancing. She wanted to catch up to him, even by just a little bit. That was the relationship between the master and spirit. Yongho could feel Catalina's sincerity. He felt her intense growing desire. He couldn't refuse such a sincere request. Yongho nodded. Okay, but only after you're able to handle Brigada a little better. Okay, I'll try. Thank you so much for allowing me. Catalina was delighted, evident by her flapping ears. Yongho unknowingly patted Catalina's head. He then fully turned around to enter the arena. However, there was one more voice that caught Yongho's attention. Master, the door of space has reached 50 completion. Wu Chia suddenly gave a report, which caused Yongho to pause. He patted Catalina's head, as she was wondering what was going on, and then, once again, headed to the arena. The door of space, a world that he had forgotten. The time was approaching for Yongho to go back home. Chapter 102, Door of Space 6. As Yongho passed the long corridor of the arena, the same guy greeted him as always. Dressed in a white suit, he had red skin and a red tail, another symbol of the red demon. Glad to see you here, said Guxian, turning around with a smile. At first, he looked ugly, but pretty cute now. Gosh, how can I think this uncle is cute? Yongho momentarily stopped thinking like that and replied loudly, Me too. Although Yongho's reply seemed rather arrogant, Guxian didn't care. Guxian even liked it because Yongho was none other than the successor of the King of Greed. So, he thought Yongho should not get cold feet in front of him, one of the 12 spirits of the House of Mammon. Watching Guxian bite a cigar in his mouth, Yongho asked again, stepping forward. How about Chwiryong's condition? Is she calm now? Lighting a cigar in his mouth, Guxian's eyebrows wriggled slightly, who then responded, She is resting on her own floor. She's still a bit unstable. I think she'll be up and running soon. She is like that, Yongho agreed. She was the one who raised up the House of Mammon on the verge of ruin. despair, and abandonment were foreign to Kaiwan. Don't you think you are too concerned about her? Kaiwan is also one of the floor masters in the arena. Someday she will fight you. Well, let's see. Moreover, as the floor master, she was not Yongho's arch-enemy, a new challenger in the arena. Fighting in the arena wasn't a real life-threatening fight. Even if one died while fighting in the arena, it was just a virtual experience of death. Of course, it didn't mean the fighting was something trivial. The pain was real. So was the sense of death. Since he trained with Aemon, Yongho had already experienced near death more than a dozen times, but the feeling of death was something he could not get used to despite his numerous virtual deaths. Okay, anyway, if you want to free Kaiwan according to your wishes, you'll have to defeat that child at least once. Guxian muttered a little while, putting out some smoke. Yongho knitted his eyes because he felt Guxian's words were a bit incongruous. In order to free Kaiwan, I must defeat her. Was he simply talking about the process of me conquering the arena? Yongho felt he didn't mean it. Let's stop our small talk here. Are you going to challenge right away? Yongho hesitated for a moment because he wanted to ask Guxian a little more about what he had just said, but somebody spoke before him. The flames of the red lotus, burning next to Guxian, said in a low voice, "Guxian with strong power, my old friend. Wouldn't that be the only story you're going to talk about?" Somehow, there was something mischievous in his words. Yongho was also curious because it was far from the way Armin used to speak decently. On the other hand, Guxian frowned. After puffing out smoke hard toward Aemon, he turned to Yongho. "You said you were learning spearmanship from Aemon, right? So what it seems like it's true. You're learning it then." Guxian's response was significant. Instead of asking him hurriedly, Yongho waited for his next words. Guxian looked back at Aemon again, then asked Yongho, "Do you have to have someone like Red Demon under your control? I'm not talking about small fries, but someone who knows how to fight." "I've got one." Yongho nodded right away. Although he felt sorry for Eligos, the first thing that came to his mind when he mentioned Red Demon was Ophelia's face. But why did he suddenly mention Red Demon? Was it because he was of the same race? Guxian quenched Yongho's curiosity in no time. Learn physical skills from that guy. More specifically, how to use your body by using magic power. "Ain't I already using it?" Yongho asked again. His question was valid. Ever since he arrived in this demon world, he had used the magic power in fights, no matter if it was big or small. If he hadn't used it from the beginning, he wouldn't have survived until now. But Guxian shook his head. Strangely, he rubbed off the cigar in the air and said, "Let me say this for caution's sake, but I'm not good at explaining, so let me show you something." Stopping there, he cleared his throat several times in a row and then corrected his position. He lightly punched twice into the air. "Do you see the difference?" Catalina drooped her ears and knitted her brows. His punch made no difference, except that his second punch was slightly faster and stronger than his first. Moreover, his posture itself was the same as before. However, Yongho was different. He noticed the flow of Guxian's magic power and realized what the difference Guxian mentioned was. The flow of his magic power was different. Yes, it was. There was something more in his second punch, something like an internal explosion in the body or circulation. While Yongho was murmuring like that, Guxian opened his eyes wide because he never expected Yongho could notice the difference, and his observation was quite accurate. "That's why Aemon made me explain to you." Instead of replying, Aemon simply laughed faintly. Guxian spoke directly to Yongho, who was still having a hard time trying to find out the difference. "All the demons survive on magical power. You know this, right?" "Yes, I do." "Good. That's why we demons are supposed to use magic power no matter what we do. My punching a moment ago explains it further." Yongho slightly wrinkled his forehead. Based on what Guxian himself just explained, his explanation was messy. However, Yongho tried to combine what he saw for himself with his experiences so far. Then he reconstructed what Guxian had said. "Does it mean that you circulated the magical power according to its movement? In other words, when you punched, did you double its speed and power by using the optimized magic power?" Guxian's face brightened at his explanation. "Oh, that's correct. How smart you are, my little master." "Little master, anyway, you're right. If you use the magic power according to your movement, you can multiply that power several times. Besides, you could move faster. Chwiryong quickly changed the topic when he was faced with how to call Yong-ho. Yong-ho nodded. He seemed to have read it somewhere in a martial arts magazine. Since we demons were born based on magical power from the beginning, we instinctively use magical power. Even though our level is different, your cute guard is no exception. It's because of her magic power skills that she could display explosive movements with her slim figure. Catalina's ears drooped a little more. She roughly understood what Chwiryong was talking about, but she wasn't sure about explaining when and how she used that magic power, which was natural because she was born with it. As Chwiryong said, walking with 2 feet, which was easy for any average man, was never simple. When one took a step, the bones and muscles of one's whole body had to react with an exquisite balance. It was very difficult to properly explain that process. But you are not like us, Yong-ho. You use magical power when punching artificially, but what should I say? It's like you're collecting magical power to use magic. That's not the natural way of using magical power. This is probably because you are from the human world, not the demon world. As if satisfied with his own explanation, Chwiryong nodded at what he said. Yong-ho too could understand it immediately this time. Chwiryong continued. As you know, your race, the Red Demon, doesn't know anything about magical power. However, they're excellent at maximizing their physical movements by using magical power. So, try and learn to use magical power from one of the Red Demons. That skill alone will make you a lot stronger than now. In fact, Yong-ho's body completely changed while he was absorbing Agares' essential teachings on physical movements, so if he could master the use of magical power, he could show amazing movements. Chwiryong took out a new cigar and put it in his mouth as if he finished talking. Yong-ho looked at him briefly and said with a smile, Chwiryong, aren't you a red demon too? Huh? Chapter 103, Door of Space 7. Although Chwiryong asked back instinctively, he could confirm Yong-ho's reply in his face. Chwiryong put out the cigar that he had just lit. Then he looked down at Yong-ho and asked, Let me ask to double-check. Are you now asking me to teach you? Well, I heard you are the strongest red demon ever. Wouldn't it be nice for me to learn from the strongest one if I had to learn at all? Chwiryong turned his mouth up at his words. He liked Yong-ho's description of him as the strongest red demon, but he had another reason. Chwiryong burst into a loud laughter for a while before opening his mouth. Man, it's the first time I've ever seen a guy like you for ages. Even Kaiwan didn't tell me to teach her. In fact, most of them around Chwiryong couldn't even speak to this guy with Herculean strength. Chwiryong corrected his posture. With his arms folded, he looked down at Yong-ho as if observing him. Then he immediately nodded. Okay, if you can run up to the 7th floor at once, I'll teach you. Now that Yong-ho ran up to the 4th floor, he had to cover the remaining 3 floors at once. Armin, who had been looking at them quietly, showed a little anger for the first time. Catalina looked at Yong-ho with anxious eyes because she could predict how her master would react. Okay, I accept that condition, Yong-ho replied. Chwiryong smiled big, then pointed at the arena leisurely. He kept puffing out cigar smoke. He looked down at Yong-ho, who was lying on the floor of the arena like a lump. Then he said with an empty laugh as if he was dumbfounded, Man, how come you really did what I told you? It would be a lie if Chwiryong didn't expect it at all, but he gave Yong-ho such a condition, thinking he would not accept it. In the arena, one was supposed to fight a stronger floor master as one moved up the floor. Moreover, the level of difficulty went up sharply, starting with the 5th floor, so Chwiryong thought that Yong-ho would crumble on the 6th floor. And even if Yong-ho managed to get up to the 6th floor, Giant Bear, the floor master on the 7th floor, was far from an easy enemy. But Yong-ho beat all of them. Granted that he skillfully used Regarder and the magical power of greed, his achievement was more than what Chwiryong expected. Amon was also surprised. My little master, your greed. No, your anguish is really amazing. Who could have expected your delusions brought about such enormous greed? The source of greed was desire, and Yong-ho's greed didn't know its end. Chwiryong tilted his head. Yong-ho asked, Anguish, what the heck are you talking about? We decided to keep it a secret. Secret? Yes, a secret. Well, honestly, it's a little embarrassing for me to talk about it. Embarrassing. Yong-ho wanted to cut off their conversation at once, but he was too weak to speak. His fingertips trembled. Perhaps it was because he was stung by the giant spider, Ongoliant, the floor master on the 6th floor. Master, are you okay? Can you hear my voice? Only Katerina was sincerely worried about Yong-ho. She let her ears droop with a sad look. It's harmful, her face was too close to him, so was her breathing. Yong-ho calmed down by reciting some passages of the Buddhist scriptures that he had learned a while ago, then took a big breath. After standing up with the support of Catalina, he absorbed the magical power of Mammon left by the floormaster on the 7th floor. Phew! It worked. He felt that his magical power had increased, and at the same time, his body got more energized than before. He broke through the 7th floor with an unyielding spirit. Although he was out of shape in body and soul along the way, he got lots of things. It wasn't just Mammon's magical power and rewards that he got. His evolutionary skills leveled up almost entirely while he was desperately fighting with his peers or stronger beings. With little more effort, it seemed that he could achieve the next level of evolution. Above all, he remembered the promise Gusion made to him. You will keep the promise, won't you? Asked Yong-ho. Yes, of course. However, you're too weak to learn from me today, so if you visit me next time, I will teach you the basics. First, Gusion was also satisfied. Honestly, he wanted to teach Yong-ho even if he didn't make the promise, for Yong-ho's growth was so fast and dazzling. By the way, do you have any good healer under your wing or something like a clinic? The injuries Yong-ho suffered in the arena were not real. However, he was mentally bruised like in the real world. A strong mental shock could inflict damage to the body, so him getting proper treatment was very important. But Yong-ho had nothing to say, because the best healer in the Mammon family was Yong-ho himself. It was a long time ago when he could talk about evolution or advancement. He thought of Horus that he had just obtained, but he was staying in the free city, not in the dungeon of the Mammon family. So, Yong-ho could not use him immediately. From the looks of Yong-ho and Catalina's expressions, Gusion could find the answer. So he said with a sigh, "All right. As we have ended up like this, we have no other choice." Gusion displayed his fingers in the air, as if examining a document. He rolled his eyes and said, "First floor, look for Skathash on the first basement floor." It was a presence on the first floor of the labyrinth of true greed at the bottom of the shallow Mammon family. Catalina's eyes opened wide at the name of Skathach. Yong-ho had also seen the name in the record. Gusion nodded. Skathach, the immortal witch. Among the 12 spirits of the House of Mammon, she is in charge of healing. Perhaps because of breaking through the 3 floors at once, Yong-ho realized that a lot of time passed when he left the arena and returned to the dungeon of the House of Mammon. After calming down Lucia and Eligos, who was nagging at him, he immediately fell into a deep sleep. How many hours passed again? Yong-ho woke up at dawn when everyone was asleep and left the Demon King's room. He was looking for the door of space, whose construction was in progress. Since it was under construction, there was no spirit involved in it, for its external construction was almost completely finished on Kaiwan's watch. What was needed now was the maturation of the magic circle to operate the door of space, namely, enough time and magical power. Yong-ho stood at the door of the space, which looked like a portal that he had seen in games. It was in the shape of a large, round metal circle on the altar. After looking at the door of the space for a long time, Yong-ho giggled. Is it just chicken and coke that I miss the most now? Dang it, how miserable I am. He missed his parents' faces, but what occupied his mind at the moment was something to eat. It had been several months since he came to the demon world. He would be lying if he said he didn't miss them. He really wanted to go back home after riding out the danger of his life several times. But he took a big breath. He now sat down and looked at the door of space. Lucia remained silent, not to disturb Yong-ho. So did Catalina, who was seated in the hallway. After some time passed, Yong-ho stood up and turned around without any regrets. Someday he would go back home through the door of space, but not now. He had no intention of leaving now, neglecting the members of the House of Mammon irresponsibly. Yong-ho himself was the head of the Mammon family, as well as the new king of greed. So, you don't have to worry, he said loudly. He seemed to have heard some flapping sound from the corridor. He giggled, but stepped forward without looking back. Then he moved forward. Chapter 104. Skathach of Aquarius 1. A herd of wolves went around at dawn. Originally, they should have been running after their prey. However, they smelled blood early on and gathered lots of clues from the smell. The smell suggested there were overwhelmingly more enemies than allies. Moreover, there was an unfamiliar smell mixed in that blood. The pack of wolves informed their boss that they should be prepared, but their boss was not in a hurry. Slowing down, they moved forward, sufficiently prepared. Their movement was like tranquility before the storm, which was so calm that anyone who did not know the situation would think it was just their casual walk. Embryo, the leader of the pack and the demon king of the wolves, was covered with blood all over its body, led by the enemies. The heads of the coalition of Western houses and their loyal spirits did not stop resisting in a spectacular display of grit until the last minute. But Embryo felt irritated, this time because the situation was so difficult. The strategy chosen by the Western family's coalition, expansion of the battlefield, was effective. They didn't allow Embryo to deal a final blow to crush them all. They engaged in small battles repeatedly for a war of attrition and focused on getting rid of Embryo's forces, not Embryo himself. Embryo was strong, and his army was also strong, but they were not invincible. The Western Houses coalition won the battlefield without Embryo. Embryo was alone, while there were several heads in the Western family's coalition. The more fighting there was, the more damaging it was to Embryo. So, Embryo also changed his strategy. He forced an inevitable fight against the Western Houses coalition, which desperately avoided fighting with the demon king of the wolves. Embryo attacked the dungeons. The dungeons in the west, which had been already conquered, or the dungeons in the north, located adjacent to the west, were ignored. Instead, he mobilized the troops to attack each of the dungeons of those heads of families belonging to the Western Owners Alliance. This time, he did not go to the trouble of occupying the dungeons like he did in the north. After occupying the core dungeons, he thoroughly destroyed them. The heads of the Western Owners Alliance could not give up the dungeons like Embryo. The dungeons deserted by Embryo were a kind of extended bases under his command, but each of them was a home base to the heads of the Western Owner Alliance. Dungeons were different from normal fortresses and castles, so the fall of the dungeons meant the death of the subordinate spirits registered in the dungeons. Heads of the houses and their spirits were connected to each other. In other words, they were in the same boat, protecting each other. Of course, their status was different from each other. Even if the dungeons were destroyed, their heads survived, but their subordinate spirits, who made the contract with their masters through the dungeons, lost their lives. The mass death of subordinate spirits greatly weakened the power of their masters. It was not symbolic, but real. The weakening of their magical power even weakened their overall physical capabilities. In order to save their spirits, the masters had to cancel their registration before the dungeons fell. However, the cancellation also greatly weakened their power. The dungeons were limited, and it was not easy for the masters who cancelled their registration to find a new dungeon. Embryo weakened individual heads, the foundation of the Western family's coalition. There were few family heads who could attack Embryo's dungeons while their dungeons were being attacked. It was clear that some heads of the Western Owners Alliance proposed attacking Embryo's main dungeons, but they could not easily carry out such an idea. Embryo's main dungeons were in the north, not the west. Moreover, there was no way of identifying which dungeon really belonged to Embryo. Embryo had several dungeons. Those family heads, who had multiple dungeons, could make one of them their main dungeon by investing time and magical power. It had already been a while since Embryo occupied the north, during which he could have moved his core dungeons if he had wanted. Moreover, Embryo did not have any subordinate spirit. There was some speculation that the wolves that he always took around were his subordinate spirits, but no matter how clever they were mere wolves. There were few family heads who replaced their spirits, whose number was limited, with ordinary wolves. If Embryo did not have subordinate spirits, attacking his dungeons could deal a psychological blow to him, but it would not weaken his power tangibly. The heads of the Western Owners Alliance could not pursue the same strategy as Embryo's. While most of them had only one dungeon, Embryo had multiple dungeons. They had to invade the northern part, relatively far away from them, but the northern part belonged to Embryo. Moreover, it was impossible for them to attack Embryo's dungeons quickly because the target of their attack was not clear. Their crucial weakness was that they were more concerned about protecting themselves. Currently, their dungeons were exposed to destruction, but there were few heads who could dare to head out to the northern areas to fight. Such a task was like hanging the bell about the cat's neck to them. Embryo took a deep breath. Sooner or later, the heads of the Western Owners Alliance would be forced to divide from within or pursue a new strategy, which would mean their unavoidable fight with Embryo that they had so desperately avoided. They would have to face Embryo sooner or later, so they needed to be a little bit more patient until then. While Embryo led his elite troops and attacked their dungeons, the heads of the Western Owners Alliance attacked the frontline strongholds established by Embryo. Even if their dungeons were destroyed, Embryo would not suffer fatal damages like the Coalition's heads, but he could not ignore the damages lightly. So, he had run desperately to defeat the task force of the heads of the Western Owners Alliance that repeated a hit-and-run strategy to avoid him. No matter how strong Embryo was, he couldn't maintain an army without supplies. He saw the front-line base several hundred meters away from him when he slowed down enough. As he got closer, he sized up the situation with his sharp observation. The front-line base was not destroyed. There were not many friendly forces killed compared with the enemies, who suffered heavy casualties. Looking at the number of those killed and the enemy's condition, his attack could be called a certain victory. Embryo now realized why he won Death Knight. The mighty Death Knight stood firmly against a mountain of enemy corpses. His presence was a tremendous pressure on Embryo. Indeed, he was qualified to claim the status of the strongest undead, along with Elder Lich. A black full-plate armor enveloped his whole body, and a dark blue cloak resembling the night fluttered in the wind. His huge magic sword, stained with a lot of blood, emitted the aura of the wicked. He was obviously stronger than any of the family heads in the southern area. Embryo laughed bitterly. The Death Knight was certainly here to support him, but his presence was like a warning. There were more powerful beings under the Death Knight's master, compared with the real force behind him. The Death Knight was just like the tip of the iceberg. Embryo, it looks like you were struggling to fight more than I expected. A harsh, gloomy voice rang from the ground. The voice belonged to the Surveillant, a servant of the King of Gluttony. The frontline base was now around the corner. Embryo stopped where he was. Instead of approaching his subordinates who maintained a strange distance from the Death Knight, he took a break with the wolves. He could not inform them about his meeting with the Surveillant. "It is a gift from the king. Use it well," said the Surveillant. Embryo gulped. He couldn't respond, nor could he engage in a subtle war of nerves with the Surveillant as usual. It was not because of the Death Knight's presence. Embryo looked in the sky. The Surveillant laughed menacingly. Embryo's competence and agility usually rubbed him the wrong way, but this time it gave him joy. "Don't forget, the king is watching you, Embryo." The Surveillant disappeared in no time. The Death Knight bowed to Embryo from a distance, but Embryo couldn't respond to both. Clenching his teeth, Embryo stared at the dazzling sky of the demon world. His presence beyond that cloud, the death monster surpassing the Death Knight. He clearly revealed the power of the 6 kings, who ruled the demon world dragon. As if responding to his quiet call, the air current in the sky changed. The mighty magical power of death disturbed the sky of the demon world. "Come to your senses, brother. Just do what you have been doing," Ophelia shouted, staring straight ahead. Blue magical energy emitted from her slim, elastic calves. Eligos breathed roughly. Suppressing excitement and tension, he clenched his fists. He gathered dark red energy in both hands and was prepared for the battle. The dungeon battle lighting could not drive out all the darkness. It could only illuminate the center of the crossroads, with a wide road in all directions. Skull, who was standing on the opposite side of Ophelia and Eligos, shouted loudly. The thunderbolt of greed arising from Brigadar's necklace was present not only in Warhammer, but also in the magic shield Yong-Ho obtained on the 5th floor of the arena. The Skull unit also shouted as their captain did. Each of them stared at the darkness while grabbing their weapons. Catalina calmly caught her breath. She controlled the magical power of greed, originating from Brigada greed, strengthened her magical power. Her black magical power was now like a blade that freely transformed itself. It was not an exaggeration to say that Catalina's body, armed with black magical power on her arms and legs, as well as daggers on both hands, was now a weapon itself. Rickham and several orcs under his control kept swallowing, standing beside Catalina. They were not seen because it was dark, but it was not easy to guess how many they were, given their shouting. The Goblin Rangers and Baduk, who stood among the orcs, couldn't even breathe properly because they felt so tense. Kya! Chapter 105. Scathach of the Aquarius. 2. Suddenly, a monstrous shout was heard. Then dungeon monsters charged from 3 directions of the crossroads. The first basement floor of the House of Mammon, the forbidden land for more than 100 years, was now occupied by the dungeon monsters. Dozens, maybe even hundreds of dungeon monsters rushed at the House of Mammon's spirits. Most of them were ghouls and skeletons. There were among them who were full of blind hatred for the living. They were the Banshee and Abomination, the incarnation of horror. Eligos breathed roughly and fast. Ophelia grinned after slapping Eligos on the back. Instead of waiting, she charged at the dungeon monsters face to face. Dang it, help me, brother. He couldn't tell her to stop as she wanted to save her life. She was like a typhoon who penetrated deep into the ghouls and kicked them hard. It seemed that the ghouls, not Ophelia, had to shout for help. Wow! Eligos rushed after Ophelia. It wasn't because he was afraid of the consequences if he didn't rush now, though it was partly true. But he had another reason. Eligos was the butler of the Mammon family. He had to show his strength befitting his status as the great Mammon family's butler. Of course, he was a little bit, yes, a tiny bit worried about Ophelia's safety. Eligos, equipped with a unique dynamic strength of a red demon beast, overwhelmed the ghouls. Eligos punching literally crushed them all at once. Awesome, brother. You look like a beast. Ophelia kicked in the air with a hearty laugh. With the energy arising from her sharp toes, she cut several ghouls with the blade of magical power. Skull, who was standing on the opposite side, also showed off his bravery. He didn't stop at merely smashing the ghouls with a battle hammer with a lightning strike. The magical power of greed soared from Brigada that Skull had on his neck. Skull, a skeleton magic knight, concentrated its magic on the hammer. He struck the ground at once to release a tremendous lightning strike. Dozens of lightning strikes that were spreading around the attacking point covered the entire corridor. Not only the ghouls, but even the Banshee, which could be said to be almost an astral body, could not avoid the lightning strike. The bodies of the ghouls exploded here and there because they could not overcome the impact of the lightning strike. Banshee's astral body was scattered in the air. Skull shouted again. Skull. It was a rush order. At the captain's order, the Skull unit invaded the place that had been devastated by the lightning strikes and wiped out the dungeon monsters. Under the command of Jun, the only female goblin, the Goblin Rangers fought in an organized manner. Baduk, with a bamboo spear, joined them. So Jun made a new formation, including Baduk, to tackle the ghouls. They weren't greedy. They held their places as if they were defending their positions in a basketball game. The Goblin Rangers were not in their element when it came to the offensive. Rickham and the orcs were excited, as they were engaged in a real fight after a long time. No matter what others said, the orcs were born fighters. But this time, they had to take a step back. There was a great wall between the ghouls, and then Catalina ran through the darkness. With the blood of the dark elf running through her body, she could see through the darkness. Inheriting the blood of the succubus, she could control the magical power of greed with amazing sensitivity. She was a shadow runner. Darkness was her friend, not her enemy. Not only the floor, but also the walls and ceiling were her fighting stages. Running through the walls and kicking the ceiling to penetrate into the ghouls, she rotated herself where she was and swung her arms. In an instant, she released the power of her black magic. The blade of the shadow raged. Soaking in the magic of greed, it stretched over a few meters and broke everything that stood in the way. Banshee, the semi-spirit, couldn't avoid the blade of the shadow, and neither could Abomination, whose thick skin denied the attack of a normal blade. The blade of the shadow changed its shape freely. Sometimes it was a giant reaper's scythe. Sometimes it was a sharp scimitar. Thanks to Catalina's mobility, which occurred almost instantly, the fighting was as good as a wide-range attack. Wow, way to go. Standing carefree among the spirits fighting against the enemies charging from 3 directions, Yongho clapped and cheered them. Salami, standing by his side, looked at him incredulously, but he did not intend to join them in the intense fighting. It wasn't a matter of Yong Ho alone becoming strong. The spirits under his control had to be strong as well. The best way to accumulate evolution EXP was the experience of real fighting that risked one's life. The more powerful the opponent, and the more fierce the battle was, the more evolution EXP one could get. Moreover, he needed to be more adept at using Brigada. Yong Ho looked at Catalina closely, in particular. He was impressed by Iligos fighting like a beast, but Catalina's progress stood out. He felt she could really challenge the first floor of the arena with her current skills. The ground shook. Dungeon monsters appeared from another direction of the crossroads. As if to make up for their absence from the fighting until now, their numbers were several times more compared to the monsters from other directions. Yong Ho turned to them. He wasn't afraid even though dozens of ghouls were charging toward him. He reached out in the air and grabbed Aemon, the Red Lotus demon spear. "Let's go, Salami," Yong Ho said. And Salami understood it. Regretting the absence of its rival Bucephalus here, Salami gathered all the magical power Yong Ho did not run. Instead, he concentrated the power of greed on the tip of Amon. Kaya ghouls popped out of the dark. Yong Ho pulled Amon and stepped forward, trampling on the ground strongly. Salami also opened its mouth wide to emit flames. The mouth of greed swallowed the flames of Salami. The one direction of the crossroads, namely the entire wide corridor, was engulfed with the waves of sparks. Not only the ghouls, but also the darkness itself was driven out. Since it was the sparks of enormous magical power, those who were fighting in the other three directions had no choice but to look back for a moment, and they all smiled. The air was on fire. The burning smell filled the hallways, and all the spirits soon had to refocus on their fighting while frowning. Yong Ho also frowned, but he was still smiling. How much time had passed? The moment Eligos smashed the last remaining ghoul's head with a fist, they heard Lucius' voice that they had been waiting for earnestly. "The first basement floor of the Mammon family has been occupied. It'll supply the magical power from now on." Magical light poured out from the ceiling. Faced with the light, Yong Ho looked around. Then he met the eyes of those spirits belonging to the Mammon family, which were ebbing away from it, avoiding the light. The first basement floor of the Mammon family. The exploration of the Labyrinth of Greed, the giant castle of Mammon, the king of greed, was about to begin now. After they won the battle and occupied the hall on the first floor, Yong Ho began to send the spirits upstairs, which didn't know about the truth. The orcs, including Rikum, did not know much about the Labyrinth of Greed. Goblin Rangers and Baduk also thought that this battle was part of the operation to recover Kaiwan's legacy, as it always had been. However, it was impossible to cheat them forever. According to Aemon and Gusion, this was the beginning of the Labyrinth of True Greed, not the fake one. Therefore, there was a possibility that a truly great facility or artifact could be discovered. Even if Kaiwan was the best of the dungeon heads for the past few generations, it didn't make sense that she achieved all of this during her reign, spanning 10 years or so. Apart from Baduk or other goblins, it was possible that June or Rikum, who had smart brains, would detect the truth. It wasn't that he couldn't trust Rikum or the Goblin Rangers, but he had to have the worst situation in mind. If the existence of the Labyrinth of Greed was known even by mere chance, not only Yong Ho, but also all the spirits of the House of Mammon would be in danger. Except for the subordinate spirits, all of the others returned to the ground floor. After confirming that the passage connecting the ground floor and the first basement floor was tightly closed, Yong Ho felt relieved and looked around the area. It was a large space. The square space, the center of the crossroads, was large enough for a basketball match. The straight corridor was also wide enough for 5 or 6 adult men to walk shoulder to shoulder. This is indeed the dungeon of the House of Mammon. Ophelia did not hide her admiration. When she showed curiosity like that, she looked like a pure girl, not a veteran pub mistress who had gone through ups and downs. In a way, her reaction was natural. Before starting the exploration, Yong Ho confessed the truth to his subordinate spirits. They were in the same boat as him, sharing his fate. Moreover, they were supposed to continue to explore the Labyrinth of Greed with Yong Ho. That was why he confessed the truth. He confessed the existence of the Labyrinth of Greed to 4 people. It was in the same vein that Ophelia was more excited than usual during the battle. In fact, she had been seized with all kinds of delusions after hearing from her father, Endelion, about the depths of the Mammon family. So, it was natural for her to get excited, because she realized that the identity of the depths was nothing but the labyrinth of greed. Chapter 106, Scathach of the Aquarius 3. Eligos also looked around and moved a lot. Catalina also did the same. Even though she was aware of the existence of the labyrinth of greed even before Yongho's confession, after hearing relevant stories while coming and going to the arena, she wiggled her tail violently in excitement. It was only Skull that remained calm. Actually, it was so calm that it was rolling on the ground. It was quite a scene Yongho saw after a long time. As you all have experienced, there are many dungeon monsters. Some more might be in hiding, so you have to be careful of their traps too. There were almost no records on the Labyrinth of Greed in the archives of the Mammon family. Since they had to hide the identity of the Labyrinth of Greed, the successive owners of the House of Mammon handed down its information to their descendants only orally. It was obvious that the relevant records were missing. What was handed down to them until Kaiwan's era was the existence of the Labyrinth of Greed, as well as the 12 spirits of the Mammon family somewhere in its depths. Catalina and Eligos became nervous at the word trap. If this was the first floor, it was supposed to contain the most traps, to say the least, because it was the first line of defense against the enemy infiltrating the dungeon. Yongho smiled bitterly at Catalina and Eligos when they erected their tails as if to show they were extremely nervous at the moment. Then he looked back at the owner of the third tail, who was moving it cheerfully. Don't you think the traps won't work properly, do you? Maybe not. That's why the dungeon monsters were moving around in droves like that. Of course, we can't afford to let our guard down, said Ophelia. Having said that, she caught her breath calmly. She knew she was going to embark on exploration, not tourism. What Yongho needed now was not a girl with twinkling green eyes, but a veteran tavern hostess. Eligos said, Scathach has another name, Aquarius, in addition to her different name, Immortal Witch. Accordingly, she has so many anecdotes related to water. I may take things easy, but if there is a residence for Scathach somewhere near here, it might be a water-related place. Although there were few records on the Labyrinth of Greed, the records on the 12 spirits of the Mammon family were overflowing. They were powerful demons that left their names in the history of the demon world even before they became the spirits of the Mammon family. Scathach in the legend was a witch who handled water and life. She was so deeply related to water that it was not an exaggeration to say that all the records about her started and ended with water. Yongho nodded and said, That makes sense. Let me keep it in mind. Good job. Eligos smiled in satisfaction at his praise. Though he was not as pleased as Catalina, his wagging tail showed he was happy. I think I have to praise him more often. Yongho made up his mind like that, then turned his gaze to Ophelia to seek her opinion too. But Skull came into his eyes again when he did that, because the way he rolled on the floor was somewhat different than usual. Skull. Skull, Skull, Skull responded, raising his body. It still couldn't understand Yongho, but they could barely communicate as the dungeon head and his subordinate Yongho could understand its meaning roughly. When Yongho approached and checked it, there was moss sprouting through the cracks of the floor. It's moss, said Ophelia, who had approached him before he realized it. Catalina also nodded. Finally, Eligos looked at Skull before turning to Yongho in no time. Yes, it's moss. Indeed, it was moss. There was nothing unusual about it. Yongho narrowed his eyebrows and soon understood why Skull paid attention to the moss. The moss was growing in only one direction of the crossroads. There was no moss in the center of the hall. No moss could be found in the other 3 directions. There was moss growing in only one direction, and the farther he looked, the more moss he could see. Moisture, said Yongho. Skull nodded with a hearty laugh. Even a little bit of water was needed for the moss to grow. Yongho thought for a moment, then looked up and asked Lucia, Lucia, can you tell me where the source of water is based on where you're standing now? The same direction as the moss is growing now. The waterway on the first floor of the dungeon of the Mammon family used groundwater as its source. Be it the Labyrinth of Greed or groundwater, it was certainly located under the first floor. If Scathach was in a water-related place like Eligos said, it was most likely to be near the source of the water. Of course, The situation would be different if Skathax built a waterway, as she did on the first floor of the dungeon, to supply water to other places. However, Yong-ho shook his head. The first basement floor had been sealed for nearly 100 years. Even if there was a waterway or any other facility, it was unlikely that they were operating properly. Ophelia, what do you think of what Eligos said? I agree with my brother's opinion. It's highly likely that Skathak is residing in a watery place, she replied immediately, smiling at Skull. Yong-ho nodded again this time and said, Nice job. He now realized why Skull rolled on the floor. Skull laughed in satisfaction. He was as happy as Eligos. Okay, shall we start? Now Yong-ho located the direction where there was the source of the water. He closed his eyes and activated the power of greed. What he wanted was Skathak, the immortal witch. He specified her images as much as possible and put together all the information he knew about her. His wild greed, exploding in all directions, converged into one. Then he went forward without hesitation. Catalina and Eligos pulled out the lighting equipment for dungeon exploration to brighten the place. They started exploring the labyrinth of greed. About 5 minutes after their expedition began, Yong-ho and his subordinate spirits were quite embarrassed because the path was too simple. It was just a straight path. There were no crossroads, which were so common, let alone corners. The traps that they were worried about in the first place were the same. There were entrances leading to small rooms on either side of the path. But they only looked straight. Another 5 minutes passed, and Yong-ho reached the end of the corridor. They stopped at a door almost as large as the width of the corridor. It was a door with a large tree embossed on it. Ophelia and Eligos grabbed the handles of the door respectively, while Catalina and Skull stood on both sides of Yong-ho. Yong-ho also embodied Armin in case of any danger. They exchanged glances quickly. When Yong-ho nodded, Ophelia and Eligos, who exchanged glances lastly, opened the door. Light poured out from inside. Moreover, the light greatly embarrassed them. It wasn't just light or lighting. Is it sunlight? Yong-ho blurted out before he knew it, and Ophelia, frowning at the sudden light in the dark, sniffed about. It smelled like water as well as dirt. The fragrant smell of grass tickled her nose. A meadow spread out inside the door. How could anybody imagine they were inside a dungeon? Swallowing, Yong-ho took a step inside the door. The wind blew. It was a wind with the smell of grass. There was a sky on the high ceiling that seemed to be at least 30 meters tall. It was the blue sky of the human world, not that of the demon world mixed with various colors. Is it biosphere? It was an artificial ecosystem that could be seen in a movie. It was weird, indeed. He could recognize that there was a ceiling, and the sky clearly stretched out in it. Then, is that an artificial sun? Warm sunlight was pouring down from a pile of light, shining in the middle of the sky. He never imagined that he would see such a spectacular sight in a dungeon like this. Suppressing his excitement, he looked around calmly. It was vast, first of all. It was a space that seemed to be hundreds of meters in diameter. There was real dirt on the ground, with even bugs and small animals on it. Catalina pointed to a corner with a blank expression. Yong-ho, who looked at it, also blinked. There was a lake. Since it was such a vast place, the lake was far from small, and there was an island in the middle of the lake. It was an island covered with ice, as if to ignore the temperature inside, which was warm enough to be spring weather. Yong-ho again focused on greed. As expected, greed stretched toward the ice island. Turning Aemon back into the shape of a bracelet, he stepped toward the ice island. He hesitated for a moment in front of the small wooden bridge connecting the edge of the lake and the ice island, but he soon made a decision, confronting Mammon's 12 spirits carried a big risk. Chapter 17. Skathach of the Aquarius 4. One could not be sure how true it was, but among the stories that had been passed down to the Mammon family was one about those who confronted Mammon's 12 spirits, but got killed for failing to pass their test. However, Yong-ho did not hesitate. He trusted Armin and Gusion. If Skathach had been too dangerous for Yong-ho, the two would not have recommended him to meet her. The island itself was not made of ice. Only the surface of the island, as well as a building that resembled a small temple in the middle of the island, were covered with ice. Yong-ho's subordinate spirits naturally posed themselves for fighting. Instead of picking Aemon, he activated the flame of greed, which opened the path by melting ice. It was as if the snow was melting. The ice blocking the entrance to the temple also melted quickly as soon as it touched the flame of greed. He felt that the ice was reacting to greed itself, not heat. Ophelia and Aligos opened the door this time too. The sunlight pouring from the sky naturally lit the inside of the temple. All kinds of light sparkled from the colorful stained glass on the ceiling, and a blue beauty was sitting on the frozen throne underneath it, with her chin resting on her hand. Just like everything else on the island, she was also covered with ice. Yong-ho was confident that she was Skathach, the immortal witch. When he first took Mammon's magic on the first floor of the arena, he saw her face. She was a beauty with blue hair, holding a water bottle. She could never die thanks to her transcendental vitality. She opened her eyes amid the melting ice. Skathach lifted her head and opened her lips. "Hello," she said just one word. Yong-ho instinctively felt that the test began. Something intense passed through their souls. Yong-ho, who closed his eyes instinctively, opened his eyes again in a strange familiarity. Everyone fell on the floor. Elagos and Catalina fell to the floor, motionless as if they passed over, while Ophelia was moaning, short of breath. Even Skull fell and wriggled on the floor without standing up properly. Skathach blinked, then said in an embarrassed voice, Are you all right?" "Really?" Even before Yong-ho could respond, Skathach showed her strength once again. This time, too, something intense passed through Yong-ho's soul, and he finally realized what it was. He seemed to know why it was familiar to him. It was the real experience of death. Skathach shocked everyone in Yong-ho's group, strongly enough to make them feel they experienced a dozen deaths. So, it was natural that they fell down. The test was hard for not only Ophelia, who was trained with psychological magic, but also Skull, who had already experienced death once. But the test was too easy for Yong-ho. He looked back at Aemon that positioned itself on his right arm before he knew. As for the experience of death, he experienced it more than 36 times. Every time he practiced with Aemon, he had to die at least 15 times. It might sound strange, but Yong-ho got used to death. They knew it. They already knew what Skathach's test was. That was why not only Gusyeon, but Amon didn't mention the test to him at all. Because of dozens of similar near-death experiences, even Ophelia and Skull passed out. Skathach looked at Yong-ho, who was still in good shape, with a strange expression, then raised her hand again. Yong-ho urgently stopped her action. "Wait a moment. I have something to give you." This is a letter from the owner of the arena, Gusyeon, with superhuman strength. Having said that quickly, he searched for something. However, he stopped moving his hand when Skathach responded quickly. It's from my sweetheart." "Your sweetheart?" he unwittingly asked back, and she nodded with a cheerful smile. "Yes, my sweetheart, my love." Yong-ho recalled Gusyeon's face when he gave him the letter. He seemed to know why Gusyeon made such an expression at that time. Her eyes were like those of a zebra before it was eaten by a lion. Gosh, is her memory distorted? Skathach was a beauty who seemed to have a very pleasing personality. She was almost as tall as Yong-ho, about 100 centimeters in height, but the ratio of her body was so good that he didn't think she was that tall. Moreover, Gusyeon, Skathach's alleged boyfriend, was a giant who was over 2 meters tall. Standing side by side, they would probably look good as a couple. Skathach read the letter carefully twice. No, 3 times. Given that she was smiling, with one hand on her cheek, she seemed to be happy about the contents of the letter very much. It doesn't look like a love letter, Yong-ho thought. The man who wrote the letter was none other than Gusyeon. Yong-ho couldn't even imagine that clunky man sitting at his desk and writing a love letter. Oh, maybe he could. Yong-ho thought there was something cute about him, but Yong-ho shook his head soon. After stopping such idle delusions, he examined his subordinate spirits lying on the floor. Gently patting Catalina's wobbly tail, he turned to Skathach. "Is this really good?" "It's okay, it's good. You might feel shocked, but it doesn't do any harm to your body, and it has no side effects. I am not a person who is hard on you." While talking gibberish like that and waving her hand, she finally folded the letter. Even after reading it several times, she bit her lips slightly, as if she still wanted to keep reading. It took about several minutes for her to put it on the handle of the chair. He thought that given her behavior, she was far from Mammon's 12 spirits like Aemon or Gusyeon. When he felt Skathak's test began, he felt some powerful magic at the moment, but it was a very short moment, so he didn't remember it. Right now, the only thing that Young-ho saw was a blue china dress, which was torn off on both sides to reveal her legs, a pure white fur wrapped around her neck and shoulders, and her sky blue hair tied up in a knot beautifully. I see, you're my little master, according to him, said Skathak, lightly clearing her throat. Given her use of the title Little Master referring to him, Young-ho thought she was Gusion's girlfriend. Good to see you. Let me introduce myself again. I am Skathash, the immortal witch, in one of the 12 spirits serving Mammon, the king of greed, and a gardener who manages the garden of life. Then she asked for a handshake, smiling brightly at him. Young-ho was rather embarrassed because this was the first time he met her, which was so different from his encounter with Aemon or Gusion. Well, come to think of it, isn't this normal, he thought. Rather, Aemon and Gusion were the ones who were abnormal since they abruptly shook hands with him. Young-ho gladly held her hand. He introduced himself, meeting her blue eyes. Im Young-ho Chon, the head of the house of Mammon. Skathak's hand was cold, but it felt good. Since she didn't let go of his hand even after shaking hands, he had no choice but to withdraw his hand first. He changed the topic, as if to hide his awkwardness. As for the Garden of Life, are you talking about this place? To tell you more precisely, it refers to the whole ground floor. Well, all the spirits who came with you fell asleep. To be honest with you, since you're the head of the Mammon family, it's the first floor of the Labyrinth of Greed. Skathak slightly winked at him. Somehow, it looked like she could easily answer his questions, so he dared to ask her one of the questions that he had been curious about for a long time. How many floors are there in the Labyrinth of Greed? Has such a basic record been missing? Sorry to ask you, but what is the number of the head of your family? Do you know the name of any previous family head? How much time has passed? She asked, tilting her head continuously, which embarrassed him again. Oh, what is the number of my family head anyway? He had never asked himself about it. Even when he looked at the family tree, he was content with checking out the family heads, but he never paid any attention to the number of the family heads. Since he overlooked the names of the previous heads, he could not remember any name. After all, he replied carefully, narrowing his eyebrows, You don't know Kaiwan, do you? Don't know. Since she didn't even know Kaiwan, it was impossible she knew Cayenne. So, Young-ho stopped asking and tried in a different way. More than 1,000 years have passed since Mammon, the king of greed, disappeared. Skathak's eyes trembled for a moment. Chapter 1-8, Skathach of the Aquarius, 5. Although the passage of time was ambiguous, she was different from Gusion, who was always awake in the arena while she had been asleep. Gosh, it seems that time has passed much more than I expected. She barely opened her mouth, but she was obviously embarrassed. Maybe the smile that she had shown to him until now was a little exaggerated. She closed her eyes once, and when she opened her eyes again, she smiled a bright smile like before and said, The Labyrinth of Greed has a total of 13 floors. As you may have already noticed, each of Mammon's 12 spirits is in charge of one floor. The 13th floor belongs to Mammon. She was not done yet. She stopped talking for a moment, then pointed to Young-ho's arm with her eyes. Ammon has no floor to take care of, because that guy is a little special. Young-ho looked at the bracelet and knew. So, he asked what came up to his mind naturally. Which floor is Gusion in charge of 7th floor? His own arena is there. Other floors are unique. But his floor is especially unique. Well, you can call it a totally different space. What she said made sense. That was what Young-ho always felt whenever he passed the long corridor leading to the arena. Young-ho looked around for a moment. There were many large windows in the small temple. Skathak's residence. The sunlight pouring over the window was warm. You said it was a garden, right? Yes, the Garden of Life. Since the Labyrinth of Greed is the residence of Mammon, the king of greed, isn't it natural that the first floor should be a garden? The Garden of Life wasn't just a symbolic name. So Young-ho responded instinctively, Oh, that's why there was no trap. Yes, it is none other than the garden of the king of greed, which leads to his palace. Wouldn't it be a good place if we didn't talk about any dreadful stuff? There were no traps on the first floor. It was literally a space open to people who came to the garden or the house. The most thorough defense of the dungeon's entrance was the basis of the dungeon's defense. However, the labyrinth of greed, Mammon's residence, completely ignored the basics completely. So, this is the king's garden. As the residence of the greatest king in the history of the demon world, it symbolized his act of differentiating himself from other kings, which was arrogant and imperious. That was why it was appropriate for the king, Yong-ho thought. Scathach looked into Yong-ho gently, then grinned with her arms folded. Okay, I like you, little master. So, let's talk a bit officially. Congratulations on passing the first test. The first test, that means you have a second test. Well, of course. Did you think you could be the master of this place by simply enduring a near-death experience? She said with a smile. However, the moment she finished talking, a huge magical power filled the palace. It was a magical power with a terrible chill that seemed to freeze everything in the world, and Yong-ho realized that it didn't just fill the palace. The magical power was tightly controlled. The magical power released by Scathach surrounded only Yong-ho, giving him a sense of pressure as if the whole world was collapsing. He might have died from suffocation in the past, but not anymore. He found the flow even under the pressure of magical power that seemed to allow for any loophole. Instead of resisting her magical power, he released the flame of greed and adapted to the flow. He mixed it with her magical power. The magical power that suppressed him naturally dissipated. His whole body was soaked with sweat. Although it took only a dozen seconds, he felt like he consumed more than half of his mental power. She was still looking at him. Then she withdrew her smile and slowly closed her eyes. She bowed to him and said, "Forgive my rudeness, head of the Mammon family. You, the descendant of the great family." The flow was similar to Chwiryong's, but different. Yong-ho replied relatively calmly after taking back the flame of greed. "I forgive you." He didn't care about his croaky voice when he said that to her. Scathach understood why Chwiryong used the title Little Master for Yong-ho. She stretched her back to stand up and said cheerfully, "Since you have passed the first test, the Garden of Life is now yours, Little Master. You can do whatever you want here. Besides, you can freely use this island, the Sanctuary of Healing." Her change of attitude was very swift, so much so that Yong-ho might have been curious if he had not forgiven her. As if she already noticed the subtle change in his look, she continued quickly. "This is the palace that the King of Greed has presented to me. In this palace I can share my overflowing vitality with others. As long as you were not killed, I could heal your wounds, though it would take some time. This would be no exception, even if any part of your body was amputated. I can also shake off your mental fatigue. Your spirits who have fallen will be healed here cleanly, so don't worry." Indeed, it's exactly what Chwiryong said to him. This was a place that would be of great help to the Mammon family with no proper therapist. "I saw a crossroad in the middle. Can I see the same space like this one even if I go another way? Just like the Garden of Life, you're supposed to, according to the original design. But I'm not sure because hundreds of years have passed already. As you said, I think I could keep this place because of my magical power. But don't you think other places were devastated? Then, all you have to do is supply magical power to restore them." But it was more easily said than done. He couldn't feel Lucia as if he entered the arena. Perhaps the area that Lucia could control at the moment was only the first floor's hall. What about the rooms attached to the corridor? Aren't they almost like a warehouse? I basically can't go outside this garden. I don't know what the previous family heads had renovated here. She shrugged her shoulders, then sat down on the chair again. She then said, while gently picking up Chwiryong's letter, "Therefore, let me announce the second and final test." Then the letter in her hand pointed to the floor. Her action carried an ambiguous meaning. "Bring my sweetheart here. Then you can be my new master. Can you do it?" Chwiryong could not leave the arena, so there was only one way to get him out of the arena and bring him here. It was for Yong-ho to be the new owner of the arena and free all the spirits out of it. "It will take some time, but I can." She laughed at his answer and said in a gentle voice, "I really hope it won't take much time, seriously." Although she was laughing, she was obviously concerned. Yong-ho seemed to notice her embarrassed look when she realized that hundreds of years had already passed. Did Mammon trap his 12 spirits in the labyrinth of greed because he was greedy? If that was true, why did they still show unchanging affection for Mammon? Amon or Chwiryong didn't answer his question. He felt Scathach would not either. Instead of facing her, Yong-ho turned around and looked out the window. There was a lake shining brightly under the sunlight and a fertile land beyond it. It was an affluent land that could not be easily found in the demon world. "Have you decided what to do in the Garden of Life?" Scathach asked from behind his back. Yong-ho nodded slowly. "Hey, you know this is the Garden of Life, right?" Of course, 2 days have passed since Yong-ho became the owner of the Garden of Life. As soon as he met with Scathach, Yong-ho, who had access to the virtual space of the dungeon merchants, looked at the farm with a proud expression. A dozen of skeleton soldiers he acquired were slowly plowing the field. Until now, the House of Mammon has purchased all the ingredients from the virtual space. In fact, the House of Mammon didn't do this. Almost all the dungeon heads in the southern areas were dependent on food from the dungeon markets. The lands in the demon world were barren. Growing grains was not easy. But the Garden of Life was different. The land was fertile. There was plenty of sunlight, and water was right next to it. It was impossible to achieve complete self-sufficiency here, but it was possible to considerably lower dependence on dungeon markets' food. Besides, farming was one of the tasks that could help him accumulate evolutionary EXP. Scathach made a long face when she looked at the undead, a symbol of death, farming in the Garden of Life. Covering her nose with one hand, she complained, "They stink. They are sleeping all day anyway." Well, that's a different matter. When Yong-ho wasn't there, she sat back in her chair and fell into a deep sleep. It seemed like she hadn't had a lot of sleep from the beginning. Also, she seemed to have consumed a considerable amount of magic power to maintain the Garden of Life. Yong-ho said with a laugh as if to ignore her complaint. "Anyway, you can make grains grow faster, right?" She pouted, but didn't say she couldn't. Yong-ho looked at the farm again happily. He was really happy to see Eligos' face, who stood in the middle of the farm, commanding the skeletons as if he owned the whole world. "Well, this is my first time seeing the House of Mammon's head in 1,000 years. Not caring much about what she said, which he actually seemed to have heard from Gusyeon, Yong-ho left her place. He got the healer in Scathach and acquired a farm that he didn't expect, but he could not afford to be complacent now. Embryo was coming from the west, so Yong-ho had to be prepared to stop him. His next goal was to secure a dungeon of the House of Randalt, which he would use as a shield to protect the west. Yong-ho stepped forward to get out of the labyrinth of greed. Chapter 1009. House of Randalt 1. "Oh, good. It looks like you are a very quick learner because you are good at controlling magical power." Gusyeon, sitting on the chair in the waiting room, clapped loudly. Yong-ho took a deep breath. Ignoring Gusyeon's voice that broke his concentration, he circulated his magical power once again. What Gusyeon asked of him was to let the magic power run constantly. His request was very easy but difficult to meet. The magical power of the demon world was like a living creature. Even the magical power concentrated in one place was supposed to constantly pulsate and move. However, the movement was disorderly, and in fact, it was often meaningless. What Gusyeon asked for was not such a pointless movement, but a purposeful movement. In other words, it was the flow of magical power that could harmonize with the movement of the body for their synergy effect. It was a piece of cake for Yong-ho to make the magic flow in the desired direction. It was an easy request. However, Gusyeon's other condition made it much more difficult to meet his request. Gusyeon wanted Yong-ho to control his magical power unconsciously. Just as people didn't think about how to move bones and muscles when they moved their hands, he demanded that Yong-ho put his magic to work naturally according to his movement. That was the basics. It was necessary for Yong-ho to embody the movement of his magical power. Just like those in the demon world, Yong-ho moved his hand. Perhaps because his repetitive training was efficient, he could move his magical power without being conscious of it. Merely moving his hand made him feel more empowered than before. "I think I'd better start training you when you don't feel that your magical power is different from before," said Gusyeon. Gusyeon could point it out because he accurately discerned Yong-ho's condition. Indeed, he was one of Mammon's 12 spirits. Yong-ho smiled bitterly. Although he knew well that Gusyeon was awesome, he didn't want to admit it somehow. It wasn't because he had any bad feelings toward Gusyeon like he did at first. Rather, it was because he was now close to Gusyeon now. "So, did you finish writing a reply to Scathach?" Yong-ho asked him sharply, and Gusyeon flinched at that. Gusion was away from his place with excuses that he was writing a reply when Yong-ho was fighting with the floor master on the 8th floor or practicing alone in the waiting room. Gusion, who was getting nervous as if he was a criminal under interrogation, quickly changed the topic and said, "So, your escort girl wants to challenge them in the arena. She made a big decision." Yong-ho laughed happily because Gusion obviously wanted to avoid his question. Nodding once, Yong-ho said, "Well, it's Catalina's choice. And I think she can do it without any problem. She has become strong, just like I did. By the way, did you write the reply?" Since Yong-ho talked more than he expected, Gusion frowned at his last words. After hesitating for a while, he took out a letter from the inner pocket of his coat. "Here you go." The letter, sealed by melted wax, gave him a pretty antique feel. Yong-ho received Gusion's reply to Scathach, but Gusion didn't let go of his hand. Still holding on to the letter, Gusion looked at Yong-ho and whispered with a serious expression, "Don't read it. Never. I promise you, never." After replying as seriously as Gusion, Yong-ho snatched it from him and put it inside his pocket. "Well, Scathach recites it to me anyway." At that moment, Gusion's expression changed dramatically. Yong-ho was prepared for a situation where this giant red demon rushed to take back the letter, but fortunately, he didn't do it. That did not happen. Gusion helplessly sat on the chair like a man who gave up everything. While tilting his head, Yong-ho sat down next to Gusion and asked, "What's wrong with Scathach? She's nice and pretty." "You seem to like it secretly," said Yong-ho seriously. She had a good personality befitting her legendary reputation as the best among the 12 spirits of the House of Mammon. It was true that she was a dazzling beauty, though she wasn't as beautiful as Citri. Sakathak was a bit of an idiot, but she was still attractive enough to anybody. Gusion smiled with an empty expression, then shook his head. Looking down at Yong-ho, he said, "I like her, but it's scary at night when I'm with her." "What did you say?" Gusion clicked his tongue. Then he said, waving his hand at Yong-ho, who opened his eyes wide, "You do not yet know the true depth of the night. You're not ready. You are still a rookie. It seems like you haven't even started it at all. Well, maybe that's why you can create such strong anguish and longing." Aiman, who remained silent until then, suddenly intervened. Gusion's eyes popped up at his heavy and serious voice. This time, what do you mean he hasn't even started it? Whatever, next time I come here, Catalina will challenge the 1st floor instead of me. I'm going to challenge the 9th floor after that. This time, Yong-ho quickly changed the topic. Gusion alternately looked at Yong-ho and Amon with suspicious eyes, but Amon did not show any particular feelings, while Yong-ho also desperately avoided Gusion's gaze. Gusion, who tilted his head several times, banished his doubts in no time and replied, "Yes. In order to bring out Brigadas's true power, the strength of your subordinate, namely your spirits, is also important. The real power of Brigada not yet. Let me tell you about it when you reach the next level. If you try to run before even walking, you will fall." Gusion looked like a man, and he was actually big-hearted. However, he was unusually inflexible now. However, Yong-ho gently accepted what he said. Since it was time to leave the arena, he asked Gusion, "How about Kaiwan's condition?" "Well, she is still recovering, but smoothly. So, you won't have to worry." Gusion wasn't the type of man who told useless lies. As he said, she was recovering really smoothly. If so, she might as well show her face at least once, Yong-ho thought. But he stopped thinking like that anymore and stood up. "Okay. Let me come back next time." When Yong-ho opened the door of the waiting room, a man in a beast mask appeared as if he had been waiting. Standing beside him was Catalina, who was training in another waiting room. He looked sharp, even though he was hidden in a sheath called Catalina. The blade named Black Magic seemed to give off a sharp light. Yong-ho reached out and stroked Catalina's hair. Whenever he touched her hair, the sharpness of the black magic gently gave away Catalina's expression, which became unusually hardened, also changed gently. "Let's go back." "Yes, Lord," Catalina replied, flapping her tail, who now went back to normal. Yong-ho also smiled happily, then stepped forward with her. It was when he was about to get out of the waiting room, when Gusion stopped him. "Hey, little master." When Yong-ho turned around, Gusion folded his arms. After a little pause, he said, "Kaiwan is the floor master on the 10th floor. and the reward on the 10th floor is special. So is the penalty. Yong-ho was currently staying on the 8th floor. There was only one floor left for him to finish, to move up to the 10th floor. When he returned to Kaiwan's break room through the long corridor of the arena, Yong-ho could shake off all the agitation in his heart. He didn't need to be particularly nervous, because he would have to confront Kaiwan. Rather, what was important was the specialness of the reward and punishment, rather than the fact that the opponent was Kaiwan. He could not yet know the rewards and the penalty. However, it was clear that he had to be more prepared than usual. "Master, what happened to you in the arena? You look pale." As soon as he got connected to Lucia again after leaving the arena, her voice was heard. Since her voice sounded quite worried, he responded brightly, "No, nothing happened. Just a little tired. Didn't anything unusual happen in the dungeon? Your subordinate spirit, Ophelia, who went as an envoy to the House of Randalt, returned. I think she came back with their reply to our surrender advice. She came back quickly. She really did. Ophelia's mission was to deliver a surrender advice, not get their reply. So, the fact that she got the reply meant that the head of the Randolph family replied quickly. Maybe they had already prepared the reply even before Ophelia arrived. Where is she now? Well, she is relieving fatigue by sparring with Eligos, a subordinate spirit. I will have her come to the conference room right now." Yong-ho didn't know what her sparring with Eligos had to do with her releasing fatigue, but he felt relieved anyway. If something big happened to him, he would not have anybody to contact because he was in the arena, but at least Ophelia was there, sparring with Eligos leisurely. "I have to hurry." "Let's hurry up, Catalina." Catalina quickly nodded, then headed to the conference room with Yong-ho. Chapter 110. House of Randalt 2. The head of the House of Randalt was already anticipating that I would come. To tell you more specifically, he knew I would come with a surrender advice written by the Mammon family. That was what Yong-ho expected. So, he asked back, what is their reaction? They were relatively calm. Here is the reply from the head of the House of Randalt. Ophelia took out a letter from her inside jacket. It was sealed more strictly than the one Gusion sent to Scathach. Instead of handing out the letter to him, she pulled it toward her chest and said with a serious expression, "It's an ordinary letter, imbued with no magical power. However, maybe there is something like poison on it. Please allow me to open it first." Just because magic existed, it didn't mean that all traps should be set only by magic. It was possible that somebody could have put a poisonous powder inside the letter, or they could have poisoned the corner of a letter. Remembering the letter poisoned with anthrax in the news some time ago, Yong-ho frowned because he didn't like the fact that Ophelia was to check out the letter at the risk of her life. But Ophelia had a determined expression on her face. So he eventually nodded. "Okay, go ahead. Thank you." She took out a knife. She cut the envelope itself and examined the letter very closely. It was almost 10 minutes or more after Yong-ho received the letter from her. "He is demanding a duel with me." What's written in the letter was very concise. To summarize it, it was as follows. "Let's have a one-on-one duel between the families without their subordinates. We don't have to take each other's lives. The loser becomes the winner's subordinate. The duel can take place anywhere in the wilderness between the Mammon and the Randolph residences. You can decide on the location. If you reject my duel offer, all the members of the House of Randalt will defend the dungeon with all their might, fully prepared to sacrifice their lives." Reviewing the letter after Yong-ho, Eligos narrowed his eyebrows and said, "So, he wants to have it out with you in a duel. He is determined to fight to the end if I reject, right?" The head of the House of Randalt's challenge to a duel was something Yong-ho didn't expect at all. Reading the letter last, Rickham said, "Well, it's my own guess, but don't you think he has offered the duel merely to save his face?" "Saving his face?" "Yes, because it isn't good for the Randolph family head to surrender without any fight. His pride might feel offended in that case." Rickham had a point to some extent. As he said, it was quite understandable that the loser would become the winner's subordinate. "What do you think of it, Ophelia?" Ophelia bit her lower lip before answering right away. She did so whenever she said something somewhat negatively. After taking a deep breath, she said calmly, "As I reported to you the other day, the head of the House of Randalt is just stuck in his own dungeon, so much so that he is called too timid. But I don't think he offered you a challenge to duel to save his face without any chance of defeating you." Requesting a duel is a double-edged sword to him. What she said also made sense. Nodding at her, Rikum added, "She has a point. He might want to try to prove his strength or worth by throwing down the gauntlet." Obviously, he sought to prove his worth, not to save his face. Ophelia also nodded this time and said, "I think he might want it. Anyway, it's true that he is strong enough to challenge you to a duel." All things considered, it was logical to think that the head of the House of Randolph threw down the gauntlet, knowing he would be defeated. Nonetheless, Yong-ho could not readily accept it. At that moment, Catalina, who was watching them silently, raised her hand timidly and said in a soft voice, "Isn't it something like a trap? For example, the House of Randolph head's offer that Yong-ho could choose the duel location could be a trap to make him feel complacent." So, Yong-ho once again read the letter from him. His writing was concise but elegant. Or he might really want to have it out with me, deciding the final victor in a duel. No, shedding useless blood. "Ophelia, do you know something about his fighting style or his strength?" Knitting her brows, she said, "Well, his fighting style or strength is not widely known because he is stuck only in his dungeon, but there is quite a bit of fragmentary information about it, given his long activities as the family head. To tell you some certain things, he's got 3 horns, and he seems to rely on magic rather than physical skills. He may be stronger than Forus or Yungsharos, but I think he is absolutely below Agares." "Is he a wizard?" "Yes, so maybe he is an easier opponent to you because you can read the flow of magical power. Perhaps you can read most magic in advance. Accordingly, you will be able to evade, defend, or disturb him easily. Anyone who was good at magic could read the flow of magical power." However, Yong-ho could discern the color and properties of magical power, and he could even read the movement of magical power even during battle. The difference between reading the flow of magical power in a calm state and reading it during a life-threatening battle was like night and day. Is it possible that the House of Randolph head will break his promise? There is little possibility that he will. It's so important that only a few reviews of this case are enough. But that's how I have felt it from my face-to-face meeting with him, said Ophelia sharply, just like a former veteran tavern owner. Yong-ho closed his eyes for a moment and organized his thoughts. The duel certainly carried great risk. With a stronger power, Yong-ho didn't need to take the risk, but he didn't need to shed useless blood. Also, he could own the Randolph family without big backlash. Yong-ho fully appreciated the concern of his subordinate spirits. He felt a strong sense of trust in them. They were loyal servants who would firmly support him, no matter which choice he would make. So Yong-ho made the decision. Opening his eyes, he said, "Ophelia, I'm sorry to say this, but can you visit the House of Randolph once more?" Ophelia, Endalian's daughter, will follow the order of the head of the great House of Mammon. Not only Ophelia, but also Catalina, Elagos, and Skull expressed their due politeness to him. Yong-ho stood up from his seat, then revealed his decision. It took 4 days for Ophelia to leave the House of Mammon, visit the House of Randolph, and receive a second reply from them. And again, 3 days later, Yong-ho sat in the special seat of the arena and gulped. Although the arena was familiar to him because of his frequent visits, he couldn't hide his anxiety as he did on his first visit. In the arena, there was a deadly battle going on between Catalina and the floormaster on the first floor. Noel Chieftain, the floormaster on the first floor, was so huge that it couldn't even be compared with ordinary gnolls. Moreover, he was very quick and clever. The sword and Jorah took control of the space by using 2 different weapons at the same time. Of course, Catalina was faster than Noel Chieftain. The blade of the black magic that she could now freely use also boasted its terrifying attack power. Comparing the 2's strength objectively, Catalina had the upper hand. Gusion admitted it, and Yong-ho could confirm it, too. However, fighting was not judged by rivals' objective capabilities alone. About 10 minutes after the fighting started, Noel Chieftain finally fell to the floor. At that moment, Yong-ho sprang to his feet and rushed to the arena without asking for Gusion's understanding. Catalina won. Noel Chieftain fell on the floor with his body stabbed by her black sword. However, Catalina didn't emerge safely. Her whole body was covered with blood and sweat, and more than half of them belonged to Noel Chieftain. When Yong-ho reached the arena, she couldn't hold up and sat down. She was breathing roughly. Moreover, the wound areas on her body swelled black as if she was poisoned. The fighting in the arena looked like an actual one, but it was not real. Accordingly, no matter how severely one was injured, one was supposed to recover after the fight. It was like how the floor masters of the arena revived even if they died in a fight. Of course, they could not be said to have been resurrected because they had never been killed. However, Catalina was different. She was one of the 12 spirits of the House of Mammon, not its head. So, some harsh rules, which were different from Yongho's, were forced on her. All of Catalina's injuries were real. A spirit like her, not the househead, had to really fight to obtain the arena's rewards. Death in the arena meant real death in her case. Catalina couldn't open her eyes properly. Perhaps it was because she actively fought without knowing she was poisoned. It seemed that the poison already spread all over her body. Young-ho tried to stay calm. He gently laid her on the floor and put his hands on her abdomen, the most injured part of her body. Then he activated the power of evolution. This was why Young-ho set today for her challenge in the arena. Assuming the full evolution EXP was 100, Catalina's EXP right before she challenged the first floor was 99. Whether she won or lost, she could not fill her evolution. EXP fully, Young-ho could cure most of the wounds thanks to the effects of the power of evolution. It didn't matter even if the wounds were so serious that they could not be treated with the power of evolution, for he could still buy enough time to take the injured to the Garden of Life where Scathach resided. Fortunately, Catalina's wounds could be healed with the power of evolution. Her expression gradually became calmer. She passed out as if she was exhausted, but her face shone with joy and a strong sense of accomplishment. Only then did Young-ho feel relieved. Approaching them from behind, Gusion laughed heartily and said, "Congratulations on breaking through the first floor.